All right, guys, time for another game theory video. I'm going to talk about, again, topics I've talked about before. I'm going to elaborate on them a little bit more in a bit of a different way. I'm going to talk about why the narrative of fighting games is important to the viewer or even the player, the story of why it's important to the viewer or even the player, right? And about why, this destruction, quotation marks, of fundamentals is actually bad to the narrative of story of fighting games, right? And take anything I say with a grain of salt, of course, but just try to flow with the story, put it in your mind to get what I'm talking about, right? So when we think of a story, say, right, maybe any kind of story, you think, oh, maybe there's a hero, there's some adversity, right, that they have to overcome. There's a bad guy, you know what I mean? Then they win, whatever. Maybe that's take it with a grain of salt. That's the fundamental basis of a story, right? You know what I mean? And then all stories have something like that. Well, so if again, why fundamentals are so important in fighting games, if we were to think of Street Fighter 2, and I've said this before, anyone that thinks fighting games are more popular than they were before, just stop. Street Fighter 2 was not a important fighting game. Street Fighter 2 is one of the most important video games ever, okay? But when we look at the fundamentals of a story like Street Fighter 2, we think of things that have such a backlash against them, like dragon punches, and it's just such an easy example to give, right? Fireballs, we're against dragon punches. You know what I mean? We don't want our move that's supposed to be a reversal to actually be invincible. We don't want to anti-air like it nor used to. You know what I mean? But this is a fundamental piece to the story of a fighting game, right? And it's what all fighting games are now based on, right? So again, and then when I talked about, you know, narratives of video games and how it's important, we think of why did Super Turbo have such a good narrative, right? And this isn't saying that any video game necessarily is the best video game ever, but again, roll with me here. Super Turbo had a great narrative because you saw the clear kind of cut potential ideologies. Ideologies, is that the English word? You saw, say, why, and as like I said before, why it's important to have, you need characters to be better than other characters sometimes. No game is going to be perfect. You want the game to be 100% balanced, again, quotation marks in the first place, but having characters that can sell your game, that are powerful, that tell the story of the game is important to the viewer and the player as well. And Super Turbo was a game that accomplished this because if, say, you have a character like Old Sagat, one of the best characters in the game, the narrative of the story of Sagat is you have that clear kind of cut classical Street Fighter 2 maybe fundamental story of fireballs and dragon punch trap. Very powerful with him, right? Fireballs, dragon punch. And then you have, say, another top tier character like Balrog. You have this ideology of we don't like fireballs, we don't like dragon punch traps. We have this character who just rushes you down, you know what I mean? He takes advantage of the game well. He shows off the game well because he has a very powerful super. He has throw loops. You know what I mean? So it's a good story in a sense for the viewer, for the casual player. You can appreciate it well, right? Because the good characters in the game, they tell the story, the narrative of the game very well. You can tell what's going on. These two kind of ideologies, cultures of what fighting games were going through at the time clashed there, right? And it was a good story, right? And I've talked about Guilty Gear. Why did Guilty Gear originally succeed, right? Because Guilty Gear, just kind of it did well enough to get a sequel. Guilty Gear X, it did well enough to get a sequel, but it was still considered just an anime game, right? But once Guilty Gear XX came out, the dust loop saved Guilty Gear, and I made a video about this before because Soul, although not the best character in the game, he was a good character, and he was a character that was in the minds of the viewers, a character being played. You could understand the story. It was easily digestible to the player, and they could see the fundamentals of what made fighting games popular in the first place with the dust loop, while also teaching them and throwing them a new spin on what fighting games could be. The dust loop, again, you had a dragon punch. You can appreciate that as a fundamental piece of what is part of every story of a fighting game. Dragon Punch, he's invincible. Then is he going to RC? Right when he RCs, you learn something new. He's teaching you something new about Guilty Gear. Then he runs in and he does like a chain combo. Oh, so you're teaching me a chain. Not that chain combos didn't exist, but again, roll with me. Chain combos into a jump cancel. Then he does a dust loop, right? The dust loop is a link. So the Street Fighter player's like, oh, okay, this game isn't just chain combos. There are links like Street Fighter as well, right? And if it was blocked, maybe it would do wild throw. So it's like, oh, there's the throw. There's that classic Street Fighter 2 mix up of am I going to walk up throw or am I going to walk up DP? And at the same time, I'm being teached Guilty Gear a little bit by the CNRC. You know what I mean? I'm seeing a chain combo, okay, you know, I'm against anime games and all these chain combo shit. But then I see a jump cancel, and then I see a link. The dust combo, the dust loop is a link. So I feel like a little more okay with that because I appreciate links as a Street Fighter player. That's why and of course Guilty Gear XX is when Guilty Gear started coming up. People started like, okay, it's not just an anime game. We appreciate it because we see that fundamental story of what made fighting games popular in Guilty Gear now. And now we're also learning about a new game with that. Right? Some games don't always have a good narrative. And I've used Karnav's Revenge as an example. You know, I'm not saying Karnav's Revenge is the worst or best game ever, but you have characters like Mizuguchi and Karnav are amazing characters. Incredible characters. For the time that game came out, Mizuguchi and Karnav they're still fucking incredible characters when you think about it even today, right? But the narrative of the game isn't the best because Mizuguchi isn't a great character, right, per se, you know what I mean? You can't really appreciate everything necessarily, right? The game still looks spazzy, generally speaking, because a lot of the good characters are just, you can't appreciate the game because you can't see them doing something that makes you appreciate the story of the game, right? You know what I mean? So that might be a game that, it might be a story like, hey, I read the story. It's like, man, the story sucked, but man, the plot twist was really cool. It's like, and your friends was like, what was the plot twist? It's like, oh yeah, that's pretty cool. But the story's like, yeah, the story kind of sucked, right? You know what I mean? So maybe you might think of the story of Karnav's Revenge like that. Mizuguchi and Karnav's are plot holes of the game. They're just so much more interesting, right? You know, again, roll with me, right? So then we get into newer school games, right? And think about how do newer school, man, I'm losing my English. How do new school games, what is the narrative of this game and how am I appreciating this as a viewer and as a player? And I give Dragon Ball FighterZ as an example, and I'll give Street Fighter V, right? Because a lot of these games, more and more, they're trying to destroy the fundamentals of what made fighting games popular in the first place. And I said, if you destroy fundamentals, of what made fighting games popular in the first place, it is not good. Of course, this girl's messaging me during production. God, this girl has fucking terrible timing. Jesus Christ. Anyway, if you destroy the fundamentals of fighting games, it's harder to appreciate, even as just someone watching, right? So let's say Dragon Ball FighterZ. If we were to think about Dragon Ball FighterZ, you start destroying the fundamentals. You have this whole wait your turn, wait my turn, whatever kind of thing. This frame data kind of shit. There's always been frame data, but the heavy emphasis on frame data. And you think about, the instruction, oh, we don't want Dragon Punches to be this invincible, or it's gotta have some kind of weakness, putting in all these kind of special rules for things. But let's look at a game like Dragon Ball FighterZ when we think of the new plot elements that it is adding to the story of fighting games, right? And you think of, and I've said this before, Dragon Ball FighterZ, I think, is actually a really interesting game. People hate all the vanish stuff. They hate all the homing dashing shit, But the thing is, that's some of the only new shit in Dragon Ball FighterZ. That's some of the only new plot elements that are being added, right? And it's actually pretty hard, if you think about it, to truly add something progressive to a game, to a fighting game, as it is nowadays, because there's even a danger to progressing fighting games too much, right? There's dangers to progressing a character too much, right? I mean, hey, Ryu, he's got to fucking progress, right? I mean, so you think, okay, so Ryu and Super Turbo, we're going to give him an overhead, and we're going to give him a Russian Fierce, and, we're going to add a little bit of an offensive, more of an offensive burst. Like, again, take it with a grain of salt, right? But like, fuck, but if we're giving him this offensive burst, should his DP still be invincible? We don't want him to be too well-rounded. Again, I have my own comments on this about what is too much and too good. You know, we were gonna give him the hop kick. You know, there's a little bit more of a poking game to go over those in Street Fighter Alpha. You know what I mean? You know, eventually, you know, we couldn't be eventually like, oh man, we got to give Ryu a throw to be progressive. It's like, well, you know, you're just going too far. We can't give characters everything because if a character progresses too much, they actually start to become not unique in the grand scheme of things. But that's another topic. But again, Dragon Ball FighterZ, the new plot elements to the story, are some of the only new interesting things in it. But the game does not actually show. I guess okay, people say homing dashing is okay. People do say homing dash and advanced. They show it off a lot, but I've said this before. The dynamic between fireballs and tug of war, the tug of war between fireballs, homing dash, reflecting, and all that kind of shit is the most interesting plot element of Dragon Ball FighterZ. But the game is so fundamentally fucked up because like there's no real block damage. You know, there's bullshit fundamentals with frame. You know, everything's so pre-contrived that you can't appreciate those plot elements, and the plot elements actually aren't even always relevant per se. You know what I mean? Again, I know people complain about homing dash, but specifically when I talk about the tug of war and how it exists with fundamentals in the game, that it should be more apparent, right? And I've talked about how you could fix this and put more of an emphasis on it, right? We take a game like Street Fighter V, right? Why is the narrative of Street Fighter V bad? Well, Street Fighter V, you know, not that Street Fighter V is not a Street Fighter game, quotation marks. I'm not saying it isn't. You can still see Street Fighter in it. And I'm not saying that the way Street Fighter V progressed, quotation marks, you know, they add more of an emphasis on this sort of, you know, frame traps, whatever the community wants to call it, you know what I mean, counter hit, you know, fishing for counter hits, whatever, you know, became more of a stronger emphasis. And I'm not against this per se, but it became so pre-contrived and everything like that. I said that Street Fighter V is actually a game that was designed to try to bring in players that enjoyed the story of a 3D game, players that enjoy the story, the plot elements of, you know, Tekken, Soul Calibur, that idea of like, you know, tap, tap, you know what I mean? I'm fishing for the counter hit. This move is plus this move is minus this. You know, in Tekken, you're going, plus tap, tap, tap. Ooh, I hit my launcher. Soul Calibur, tap, tap, hit my counter hit. There's that little red flash. Is it a red flash? And I forget what games are red flashes. I think maybe one game might even be a blue flash. I forget. But, you know, you're tap, tap, tap. You know what I mean? Fishing. There's an element that the player appreciates that part of the story of 3D games, right? There's more of an emphasis on it. And so they made a Street Fighter V like, hey, it's still Street Fighter, quotation marks, a bullshit Street Fighter, right? You know, taking away so many things. But hey, we're going to add in these story elements of what make players that enjoy this story, and hopefully they can enjoy our story, and we can combine these two stories to make an ultimate story. But the fundamentals are so fucked up, you can't actually appreciate it. You know, when a game progresses, a game should be not one step forward, two steps back, one step forward, one step back, whatever. That's not real progression. That's stagnant, right? So, you know, I want you to think about it like this. If we were to think about, again, the history of, and when I compared this to a story, regular stories, we have a hero, we have a villain, maybe there's a plot twist. They have to overcome some adversity, and they're better than like a fundamental idea of a story, right? Well, if we have a fundamental idea of a story in a fighting game, fireballs, dragon punch trap, this character's a throw character. My character's fireballing you, your character's the big strong dude, right? He's trying to throw me. Oh, you know what I mean? Block damage is a fundamental part of a story of video games that they're getting rid of that is not good. Again, Dragon Ball FighterZ. Oh, my character has no mix-up. Well, you know what? Mix-ups, again, there were mix-ups before in Street Fighter, right? But think about it from the perspective, if I keep shooting fireballs at you, the fireball is a, quotation marks in a sense, in a perspective, a mix-up. Because you can't keep blocking that fireball, or else you will fucking die. You know what I mean? So Dragon Ball FighterZ, oh, there's no mix-up. Well, you know what? If you wouldn't be able to keep blocking, if you wouldn't have destroyed these fundamentals, this plot element that has made the story of a fighting game popular in the first place, if you would have gotten rid of it, you've ruined the narrative. If a casual viewer looks at Street Fighter V, imagine they look at Street Fighter V and like, oh, hey, it's a fireball, it's a dragon punch trap. But imagine you're listening to a commentator, right? And again, I said this before, frame dead has always existed, but it wasn't relevant to how you talked about a game. You can watch Super Turbo now. No one's talking about frame dead, this is frame, this is supposed to, because it's not how you fucking played the game. It's not what you talked about, right? Imagine a casual player is, or a casual fan of just a person watching video games tunes into a Street Fighter tournament. Imagine, like, oh, this move is plus this move is minus this. Oh, like, can you appreciate that? Like, and it's like, hey, oh, Street Fighter, I remember this game. Fireballs, dragon punches, this guy's a throw guy, whatever. And you're watching, it's like, oh, dude, he couldn't attack there because he was plus this, minus. Can you imagine that? Like, you're at your friends like, what? I don't get this. Like, I just hope it looks cool, right? And I guess I hope it looks cool because I don't know what the fuck they're talking about. Plus this, like, isn't a dragon punch? Doesn't that normally get? It's like, nah, dude, they retcon that part of the story. Like, what do you mean they retconned it? It's like, well, dragon punches actually they got to be a few frames before they're invincible now. Like, and like they changed the story. Yeah, they changed it. And like that move, you can't keep tapping it. You got to do this, and then you got to let that guy go. It's like, wow, they changed the story like that. And it's like, yeah, that's kind of how that's the story they changed it. So you're changing the fundamental. Can you appreciate that? And again, there's this idea that they made games so predetermined. People try to argue that because to bring in more people, to level the playing field. Maybe it leveled the playing field in a sense that it was just for the Jimmies and the Timmies and the nerds. Because think of it, if a fighting game was, you got to get your high school diploma, right? And it's like, hey, here's again, this was, you don't look at video games like this before. Every time, like, oh, hey, I'm gonna read my cliff notes before the match. This is plus this. My move is minus this, so I can punish this, and then I do that. You're looking at your phone, whatever. This is blah 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 blah. This is the cliff notes. This is how I passed my high school test. And if everyone knows these cliff notes, this cheat sheet to the test, they can do just well enough to say that I know just well enough to pass this test. I know just well enough to say that I know enough about the story, that I know enough about the game, that I am competent in the game, if you will, right? But that's not a good narrative, right? That's not interesting, right? You know what I mean? Like, what kind of narrative is that? You're changing the story and you're appealing to people, just nerds, people who that believe execution is part of a skill of a fighting game. People believe that free flowing ideas, trying to are important. People that want things to be so pre-contrived, predetermined, right? So that everyone can throw the Hail Mary pass. Everyone is Hail Mary pass. Everyone is the star quarterback of the team, right? That's not a real story, right? That's appealing to nerds who think that fighting games should be a math problem, and that's also bad on society because, again, the thing is, fighting games are not more popular. Being a nerd is just more accepted now, right? People, more and more realize that everyone can be nerds, right? And I've said this before. When I got into fighting games, I realized, man, the people that were the nerds were the people that, there are nerds that are good at video games, but a lot of these nerds were not good at video games. You know what I mean? This shit did not help them. Most of the people that are the most nerdy at games were not good at games, right? And that's what people got to realize, that lots of people are nerds, right? This isn't helping the story. Like, you just trying to make this thing a math problem isn't good for the story, right? So hopefully you get what I'm talking about. Narratives are good for video games, right? But when you make the narrative just a math problem, that's not a story of a game. That's a cheat sheet just to make sure everyone does just well enough to pass high school, something like that, right? And you can't also even, this doesn't help the casual person understand the game either, because the casual person can look at a fighting game and be like, he's plus this, he's minus this. Like, dude, I don't get this. Did they retcon the story? What's going on? Like, this fundamental idea of the story just doesn't matter anymore. No, it doesn't work like that. That has to happen now. You know what I mean? Like, do you really think anyone understands? Do you think anyone looks at a game that they don't understand like that? Be like, oh, numbers. I instantly understand. No, it doesn't make any sense. Anyway, going a little in depth more on that topic. The end.